Good day, everyone. I'm Steve Levy with Ipsos Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 6th webinar in our Path Forward program. There's a few quick housekeeping matters that we should take care of off the bat. First is that while you will remain in listen-only mode, you can submit questions by simply clicking on the question button. Your question will be submitted to us privately, and we will attempt to answer all of those questions today, time permitting. If we do run out of time, we'll be sure to get back to you by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and it will be posted to our website in the next 48 hours. Now, the Path Forward program is very much intended as a thought-sharing platform that will cover pretty important business issues that many of you and your organizations are no doubt facing today. At Ipsos, we've been running a weekly COVID tracking study since March here in Canada and, in fact, in 13 markets around the world. Now, despite the fact that the provinces are beginning to open up, certainly some sectors of the economy, we still see that half of Canadians remain worried about returning to work. The majority of Canadians still see travel, they still see gatherings of any kind of large size, and in fact traveling on the transit as risky business. So going back to work is going to be a slow process, and in fact many of our clients have already made the point to us that they don't see going back to what you might think of as traditional work before the end of this year. The tracking program that I just mentioned covers a swath of issues. If you're interested in hearing more about it, don't hesitate to reach out to me at steve.levy@ipsos.com. If we look back over the past 10 weeks or so, we've seen much change in the advertising landscape. We've seen advertisers pause, they've pivoted, they've adjusted, they've remixed, and they've reshot. Many leading experts argue that it is imperative that brands should not go dark during an economic downturn. But it's also important to communicate using an appropriate tone, a different tone than perhaps was used prior. Advertising in the age of COVID, and more specifically, Canada's creative fightback, is the subject of today's session. The first part of today's session, Ted During. Ted, give us a little wave if you don't mind. Thank you, Ted. Ted leads our creative excellence team at Ipsos, and he's going to share some research and some of his thoughts on how Canadian consumers want brands to communicate to them, as well as some of the reactions that we've seen to COVID-related advertising. We're also joined by Brett McIntosh. Brett gives a wave. Thank you, Brett. Brett is the president of Publicis Toronto. He'll offer some commentary throughout Ted's talk and will join us for a discussion at the end. The camera is going to go blank at this point, so don't think that you're losing us. You're not. You will hear the commentary and you will most certainly see the slides. So at this point, I'm going to make the point that this truly is a TED Talk, and Ted, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, and welcome all to Canada's Creative Fightback. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. As Steve mentioned, today Brett and I are going to discuss a few topics, one being whether creativity still matters, how Canadian brands have responded to the COVID situation, how Canadians have reacted to some of the ads that have been put out, and where do brands go from here. So in creative excellence at Ipsos, we always stress to our clients that creativity matters. It is really the key driver of an ad's effectiveness. We also see this evidence from well-respected institutes and our own data. So looking at some of the work Peter Field and the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, or the IPA, have done and measured, they've measured that campaigns using creatively awarded work has on average 11 times the market share gains of non-awarded work. And the winners of awards at the Cannes Creativity Festival display 3 times higher stock market performance. Of course, we know not every ad can be an award winner, but from our own Ipsos database, what we do see is that creative which scores highly on our creative effect index has on average a 20% higher sales lift than average scoring creatives. So it is our opinion strongly that creativity does matter. But as we all know, we're in unprecedented times right now. So while we're seeing things opening up a bit in Canada, a large proportion of our population remains in lockdown. As Steve mentioned, people are still concerned about going out, moving freely, going back to their jobs. And we're not just experiencing an economic crisis, but a life crisis where we fear for our lives as much as we fear for our livelihoods. So we ask the question, in these times, does creativity still matter? And as Steve mentioned as well, going dark is not the answer. And some of the leading industry thinkers and CEOs feel this is the case. And judging from all the ads produced as a response to COVID in Canada, a lot of you on this call also feel this is the case. So looking at what Mark Ritson, who is now a virtual marketing professor, what he said brands should keep the brand light burning because the cost of snuffing it out for the rest of 2020 and then trying to reignite it next year is gigantic. And looking at some thoughts from Jeff Harmening, the CEO of General Mills, he feels that advertising can provide a sense of normalcy for people as their lives are anything but normal right now, as our lives are anything but normal right now. So for him and his company, they feel they have a responsibility to do that, whether it's delivering their products to people on the front lines or whether it's advertising a brand like Cinnamon Toast Crunch. So this is a good time to get Brett's thoughts on this issue. So a couple of questions for you, Brett. What were your clients contemplating and considering once the crisis hit? And what questions specifically were they asking your teams to answer and advise on?
Thanks, Ted. Well, I know we'll all never forget this point in our life and what we're going through now, and we certainly won't forget it as marketers and communicators. And you know, I'll always remember that 2-week, 3-week period at the onset of the crisis that, you know, was probably the hardest I've ever worked in my life. And it really was formed around responding to our senior client marketers' needs. And really they were asking us 2 questions. And I believe in everything that we said around marketing as an investment and the importance to keep it going. But in an immediate onset of the challenge, there were 2 fundamental questions. 1, should I cut? And if I cut, how and how much? And 2, if I can't cut or it doesn't make sense for me to cut, how best to use? And certainly the interplay of those 2 major, you know, themes and questions was really how we spent our first 2-3 weeks working with our clients. And of course, in the latter, and they were connected. No client was able to cut and get out of all the media that they had booked, nor did they necessarily want to. What that left them with was how best to use. And really it came down to, you know, in essence, 2 asks of us. Should this be a moment for us to share and demonstrate our response and our involvement with the cause? Or is this a relevant moment for our products and services and the focus of our products and services to be have utility and usefulness during this cause? And it was really, you know, 2 full weeks of interplay with media, interplay with clients, getting through this this work of when and if to cut, and then how best to manage our message moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you, Brett. That's a good segue into talking about how brands should respond, as you mentioned how the questions that were being asked of you. So let's talk about how consumers feel brands should respond and what they actually want to hear from them overall. So what we're seeing really is that the majority of people want to hear from brands right now, especially brands that are perceived to be helpful. Only 10% are saying that brands who advertise now are tone deaf. So, of course, as Steve mentioned, tone does matter. You don't want to appear to be too opportunistic during these times, nor do you want to showcase behavior that breaks new social conventions or norms. But on average, consumers definitely want to hear from brands and what they have to say and how they can potentially help. So what do Canadians want advertising to help them feel right now? So what we're seeing is really they want two things, first and foremost. One is a sense of optimism or well-being. The other is a sense of security. Canadians are also looking for normalcy in the content they view in these uncertain times. Specifically, they're looking to feel entertained, and they're looking for some escapism. But they also want to keep up to date with the latest news at the same time. So now that we understand a bit about the mindset of Canadians in terms of what they're looking for in content and communications, let's see how some Canadian brands have been communicating and how consumers feel about the ads that they're seeing. So our colleagues in the U.S. have been evaluating U.S. COVID ads, and we could have used that data for this webinar, but given this is Canada's creative Fightback, we wanted to gain a concrete understanding of how Canadians were responding to Canadian-specific COVID ads. So through our online community, we evaluated 15 ads, three each from 5 different sectors. We looked at ads from the financial sector, the automotive sector, the retail or services sector, the food services sector, which is grocery delivery services and QSRs, and government or PSAs. And we took a look at these ads on 4 questions: credibility of the ads, perceived uniqueness, perceived relevance, and brand impact overall. We used our benchmarks to assess performance of the ads on these metrics. So let's take a look at what we found out when we asked consumers to evaluate these ads. What we're seeing, the first finding, is that results are very mixed across all sectors. We know that from what Brett was talking to us about, as well as what other industry experts, as well as what we think, is that brands wanted to keep that brand light burning, and for the most part, a lot of brands did overall. But given the limits on movement, on social distancing, comms were being developed very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of time to maybe review or evaluate. So perhaps this finding should not be that surprising. It also lines up with our pre-COVID ad testing work. We always generally see extremely mixed results across all sectors. Just now we're seeing potentially different reasons for these mixed results, which we'll get into. So taking into account the mixed results, we also see variances across the different sectors in terms of performance. So we'll talk first about finance, which is the yellow bar. And finance generated pretty much an average performance on relevance and brand impact and credibility overall. These ads that we evaluated, they were really focused on, we're here for you and our employees type messaging versus helping consumers by doing something such as maybe cutting interest or mortgage rates. So that's part of the reason why we're seeing that average response to these spots. The food service line is orange, and what we can see is that these ads were felt to be very credible, relevant, and generated brand impact. They were generally focused on explaining what precautions they were taking for customers and employees, and that they were doing their best to keep products in stock or utilize contactless delivery. The automotive line is the purple line. These ads were not felt to be that relevant or impactful. They were seen as average credibility. People are less likely to be looking at a vehicle right now, which could be diminishing some of the relevance and impact of those ads that we evaluated. The retail line is the blue line. It has very similar results as the food service line for very similar reasons. And then the PSA or government type ads is the turquoise bar. And these ads were focused really on information. And we know from what we saw earlier that Canadians are interested in keeping up to date with what's going on. So these ads focused on information that did help Canadians keep abreast of what was going on in terms of social distancing, in terms of limitations. So they were felt to be very credible, relevant, and generated some impact. So thinking about back to how Canadians wanted advertising to make them feel, we took a look at the 15 ads in a different way. We classified the ads into 3 key themes: security, well-being, and leadership. So what we're seeing is that the leadership line is purple, the well-being line is orange, and the security is yellow. So what we're seeing is that credibility isn't an issue for really any of the ads, but focusing on well-being and leadership performs stronger than ads that are focused more on helping Canadians feel secure. So while we saw that was a feeling that Canadians, want advertising to make them feel, the executions that we evaluated that dealt with this theme didn't quite deliver on relevance or brand impact. So when we evaluate advertising, we often use a baseball diamond analogy. Some of you on the call who have seen some of our presentations probably have seen this before. And our philosophy really is that you need to round all the bases to deliver brand impact, which would be home base. So all of the bases are important, but you need to round first or break through before you can do anything else. And what we saw in that uniqueness pillar is that most of the COVID-related ads we evaluated generated average at best uniqueness, suggesting breakthrough issues. And while we saw some of the commentary in the ads we evaluated that Canadians did appreciate the empathetic and reassuring messages that these ads delivered, there's a strong sense that we are getting tired of seeing the same types of messaging from different brands, and we are looking for advertising to help bring back that sense of normalcy to our lives overall. And I will say that these results are very consistent with what we saw in the U.S. as well. So this seems like a great time to get Brett's thoughts about how he and his team have been creating ads these days. So Brett, how are you going about this, and what have been some of the key challenges that you faced?
Well, thanks, Ted. I mean, and just to further my last comment, it's been the most challenging time of my career, and certainly for the agency, but it's one that's been an incredible thing to be part of. I think if really simplifying it down, what we've been working with our clients on is almost asking ourselves three really core fundamental questions when we're planning their development and creation of ads. One, what's the relevancy of our planned message? And is that, to your point on some of the COVID-related ads, is it cause-based? I'm using kind of, big C cause-based message relevant to the crisis at hand? And if so, what's our solution and our support of it? The second primary, or do we have the right product or service? That makes sense to be advertising. So first we wanted to look at relevancy and which path, if not both, was appropriate for the brand to take. Second is the message, is the focus truly compelling? And working with them to ensure that that messaging is compelling, be it that of a COVID-related message or continued support of product or service at this point in time. But perhaps the biggest challenge to this whole thing has been how do we actually, once those two things are settled, how do we actually deliver and produce with all the restrictions that we're facing within society and generally our freedom of movement today? And the way we're seeing it is that next major shift in our industry, post-financial crisis and over the course of the last decade, we've spent years as an industry becoming more agile, nimble in our ability to produce content effectively for clients and building out these maker cultures, be it within clients in their own in-house studios or be it at an agency like ourselves, which has built out studio spaces, 20-plus editing suites, shooter talent on staff. We see now this post-COVID as being the onset of that next generation of maker crisis because we truly are having to produce with, at most, either 2, maybe 3 people on set, distancing appropriately, shooting it with a DOP and their family, director of photography and their family, turning to animation, turning to existing client footage, and doing so within a matter of hours, not necessarily days. And all within that lens of, to your point around sameness and brand impact, how can we actually produce something effectively that is going to deliver a compelling message and a relevant message at a time when Canadians were still hoping and if possible to be entertained? And that was really the challenge. Is messaging and was one thing, but production was actually our biggest issue.
Great. Thank you, Brett, for that. So as Brett was mentioning, and as we've discussed so far, The first wave of COVID-related ads really focused on empathy and comfort. It's what Canadians wanted. It's what they needed to hear. So showing that empathy and giving comfort was important. We're now to the stage where we have recognized and informed new social norms, and we're looking to help Canadians develop new routines. As my colleagues Brad and Leslie talked about in their webinar on empathy a few weeks ago, empathy and understanding your consumer are still very important for sure. But there is a need to shift communications in order to meet these ever-evolving needs. So advertising, I've seen this in my career so far, has been called the great mirror of society. So let's go through some tips to help Canadian brands win in the creative fight back. So the first tip is really be authentic and faithful. Be true to your brand. Leverage key brand associations and distinct assets in order to help your brand stand out. As Brett said, there have been challenges with production and creating. But one thing brands do have is assets and distinct assets that they could potentially leverage. So that could be a part of the way that you can stand out. For example, Galen Weston has had a long history of appearing in PC and Loblaw ads. Consumers like him. And it made the message about what Loblaw stores were doing for Canadians and their employees during the pandemic come across as very genuine and true to the brand overall. The second tip is make sure you act and do. So brands need to earn the right to talk about this challenging time by acting first and communicating second. Yes, we want to keep our brand light burning, but it's important that consumers see your brand taking action and that this is perceived to be, again, genuine overall. Some examples of this are Tim Hortons, employees delivering coffee to the front line, Mill Street and other beer brands producing hand sanitizers, Canadian fitness companies offering at-home workouts. These are just some things that showcase brands and companies acting and consumers being able to see that they are helping. The third is really find the right story and strike the right tone. We always stress that storytelling is a key component in effective advertising and creativity. I would argue that storytelling is probably as important as it ever has been. But we need to ensure the tone is right. So remember from before what Canadians want advertising to make them feel. So they want to feel a sense of security. They want to feel a sense of well-being overall. So try to infuse some positivity and optimism. And we also saw that Canadians are looking at content that helps them feel entertained, helps them escape a bit. So potentially a laugh or two certainly wouldn't hurt. Again, keeping in mind tone, but trying to infuse some fun and laughter in your communications. Ideas for supporting for coping. So fun stuff to do while maybe you're stuck social distancing or stuck as a family indoors. That again helps your brand potentially carve out a new niche as part of a new routine for Canadians. But being reassuring and calming is also key. Again, that doesn't need to be boring, but our tone, we need to watch our tone and make sure we're respective of society and where it's going right now. And then reinforcing that sense of community. So encouraging community compassion and really coming together. So it is important to find that right story and strike the right tone. And along these lines, there's also a window to potentially reinvent or repurpose a brand to align with the new world and mindset. So these are things that you could potentially do, identifying a relevant role for your brand, aligned with consumers' new habits and behaviors. There's potentially an opportunity for your brand to connect in a meaningful way where consumers are craving connection and solutions to their uncharted, unmapped new life. And then, again, being unique and distinct in storylines or in use of brand assets, that's something that can be important. We've heard the word, I'm sure everyone's maybe tired of the word fluid. It's a fluid situation, but it is a fluid situation, and brands need to adapt and evolve to the situation at hand. So just a couple key points to sum up. So the first is, again, be active. Don't go dark. Try not to sacrifice creative, but we need to understand the current contextual nuances overall. Don't get caught in the sea of sameness. As Brett mentioned, it is challenging on agencies and clients and brands' parts in order to create content when you can't actually go to a studio or film something. But again, it's about potentially leveraging your distinct assets and what people know about your brand and what that is distinct about your brand that can help maybe break out of the sea of sameness until we can get back to producing content as we were. Again, be prepared for fluidity, be prepared to evolve and adapt. And there is potentially an opportunity for innovation, and not just in the sense of creating a new product, but in terms of maybe innovating the way people think about you and feel about you. So don't let the uncertainty paralyze. Let it fuel creativity and future building. Creativity definitely does still matter, and brands that get it right now will be poised to long-term success. So I thank you on behalf of Brett. I thank you for your time, and we'll push back to Steve.
Okay, thank you, Ted and Brett. If you could both jump back on camera. And just before we jump into conversation, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that came up from a number of the 200 or so people who are listening. The first is, if you do have questions specifically about the study that Ted talked about, please do feel free to reach out to him directly. The second question that has come up a few times is, will a recording of this session be available? And yes, I did make that point at the beginning, but I'll make it again, that within 48 hours of the close of this session, you will be able to go to our website. The recording will be posted there. So let's jump into a few conversation starters. The first one is that both of you reinforce the point that creative is evolving, that there's a need for sensitivity, that there's a need for a different tone. But at the same time, can you both talk to the line, if you like, between doing what's right at this time, being sensitive, having the correct tone, but at the same time recognizing that advertising has to show a return? Talk a little bit about the dividing line between those two. Brett, maybe you can start.
Sure. I think in those early days, whether it was an innate, unconscious or not, return was still a notion that every marketer was working through. And at that time, in the heart of the crisis, the return was very much the impact on the brand and what's the role that the brand had to play during that period of time, and not necessarily sales return. But what we're seeing, and I'm sure as many are, is the pressure is to shift that focus to deliver return that is, in a more traditional sense, sales. As the country opens up, as particular categories open up, the first and foremost question is, what do I need to do to deliver sales as a return? But it's not at the expense in its entirety of some of the great gains, quite frankly, that many brands have made, in different attributes, like trust, over the course of the last number of months. So, what is return, I think, is what's being questioned over the next number of months. But certainly some anxiousness around getting to selling product and services is really the focus of many marketers now.
Yeah, and I think to add to that is, we do see that if you create a good feeling around your brand through your advertising and the stories you're telling, you can bring people closer to your brand, what Brett was alluding to, but also that can have an impact on sales if people see your brand in a different light. I think that if you have a product or a solution that has a direct impact on people's lives right now, that if you do go out with something, a piece of communications that highlights that, but also highlights how you are helping the consumer and how your product may be helping the consumer, I think that's another way to generate sales during this time without being overt about it. It's part of, if it satisfies a need, then you should definitely be talking about it.
So there you are. You're a brand guy for a service or a product, and your strategy is not. Let's assume your strategy is not tone deaf, but let's also assume that it's not COVID inclusive, so to speak. But it is very much on message. And you've been doing this for a while, and now you find yourself in unprecedented times. should this advertising, should this kind of campaign remain in play?
I can start if you want. So what we're seeing is that we are seeing now some clients come to us with tests for what you referred to, Steve, as non-COVID type advertising, and we're seeing mixed results. We're seeing some do well and some don't, and it's not necessarily because they're inappropriate. It's just because of the power of the creative. I think that if your message is true to your brand, and if you are going out with something that doesn't violate new social norms, isn't totally tone deaf, maybe is a bit amusing, I'd say that it's probably okay still. Again, likely you should evaluate it before you go back out with it, just because of the shift. But I'd say that you may be okay. Again, being genuine, being true to your brand is something that is important overall, and I think that the messaging could still work.
But what do you think?
I think, well, I actually pick up on something Ted said in the previous answer, which I think is relevant to this as well. In that instance, I think if you're feeling confident, and research can bear that out, that you're fulfilling a consumer need with that product or service versus clearly just a want or a luxury in one's life, then certainly you can feel even more confidence around a non-COVID related or non-COVID specific initiative. And, in most products in some way, shape, or form are fitting what we need today out of our life. And so if you're fulfilling that need, I think you can feel pretty confident in advertising it, as long as it's not tone deaf, as you said, Steve.
Ted, you used the Galen Weston example earlier in your presentation. Galen Weston obviously has been on TV in the past. He did voiceovers for a while. Now he's back, both in email and on TV. I think many of my colleagues would argue that this is a time when people are thirsty for leadership. People want to be told what next, where to go, when will things happen. Do you think that this is a time when CEOs of major corporations should or could be stepping into the limelight, being on camera and conveying whatever it is they may convey? What do you think? Ted?
I think that it depends. I think that right now people want relatability. They want that sense of normalcy. I think that's why the Galen example is a good one to show, because he is genuine. He comes across as very genuine, and people relate to him overall. I don't think necessarily you just take every CEO and put them on camera. I think there needs to be, the relatability needs to be there, as well as a message of what is this company going to do, or what's this brand going to do to help make things a bit better. I think if you have that type of message and a relatable spokesperson or leader, then I think it could work.
Brett, do you want to add to that?
Sure, a couple thoughts to add. And, maybe I'll go to the reality of creation and production just to start, which is a touch less strategic, but all the point relevant as well. First of all, during what's going on right now, does the CEO have what is in essence 20% of their time for that week available to them? If you think about it's going to be a full day of production over the course of a 5-day week. We know most people are working 6 or 7 days right now, but you're asking a lot of that CEO. But if they do, point of consideration taken. Secondly, what I found, and where Galen works so well, is, and to your point, Ted, when we get to know these leaders, it's often through a multi-execution platform. It's very difficult for a CEO that isn't, red light ready, if you want to call that, to cut through and break through, in my mind, on a single execution. So if you're committing to a platform, I think that starts to tick a box. And then thirdly, this is where it gets a touch more strategic. When they're really making a significant commitment, and the voice of leadership is necessary to underscore just how important that commitment is, then I think there's a relevance to it, certainly. But I do think there's a lot of executional requirements that you have to go through with CEOs to ensure that they're effective on ground.
But do you think it's too risky?
I think you're asking, look, there's been fantastic campaigns. John Legere with T-Mobile over the years, Galen, as we've seen. I think with a low production cost but significant media commitment, you have to make sure that that CEO thinks he can really carry the voice of the brand and carry the voice of the message. And if she or he is not fully committed to it, I do think it could be too risky. But it's certainly worth consideration in this day and age.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well.
So here's a question from one of the 130 or so people that are still on the line. This person says, can you give me a concrete example of something that worked really well and something that perhaps didn't work so well?
Always when you ask the off-the-cuff questions as they come in. Ted, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. I mean, I think without maybe revealing the brands, I think there's been some examples of things that just didn't match with the sentiment, and it was brands that were trying to maybe seem supportive, but the messages came across as maybe a little disingenuous, and people were maybe not as, moved by them. I think the ones that we've seen do well are the ones, again, that focus on what are brands doing to help people. And it's not just people, it's like their employees as well. And I think this was more so in the first wave, and I think people are getting maybe a little tired of this, so it'll be interesting to see what the next wave is in terms of how brands are responding. And we're already sort of seeing that with some of the testing we're doing. But yeah, I think without getting specifics, those are the two types of things I've been seeing.
So that's a good segue to another conversation point that we wanted to include, which is that, look, you both have alluded to the fact that brands have changed, even during the 10-week period in terms of messaging. And many of them have moved from dialogue, if you like, which is very much about comfort and reassurance, to, for want of a better word, deeds. From dialogue to deeds, actions, help. So that being the case, where do brands go from here? What's next in the state of advertising evolution?
I'll start. I think, sorry, Brett. I think what we're seeing is that we are still seeing some deed type things. It's more about like what types of services now are people going to provide as we enter into different stages of what the new normal is, or what today's normal looks like, and who knows if it's going to continue. Hopefully it continues to trend in the right direction. But I think that's what we're seeing now, is how people are going less about we're with you, because I think people understand that most brands are with them. Now it's more about what are we doing for you, what are we doing for society, what are we doing for the front line. So I think some of the messaging and the evolution of the messaging is going in that direction, at least what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And, where I see things heading is we've been in our crisis state. We're now in the heart of our reemergence. And how do I drive sales? But really within the context of the products or services that I have as a marketer and as a business available to me. I think the pressure on marketing departments and the pressure on those responsible for communications is going to come with that innovation and that look at just what do I have to market, and what role am I playing within the organization to continue to shape our product or service so that it's highly relevant to what consumers and Canadians are needing today. And I think that's going to place a significant amount of pressure on marketers and their partners to be, quite frankly, just more integrated than ever before. To be, working that funnel from product and service ideation through to execution. The dependencies in this kind of current COVID and post-COVID world are going to be more significant than ever. And I really think what's that next frontier is the creation of net new products and services or derivatives of current ones to deliver on consumer needs.
So the last conversation point that we're going to have time for today is a little off topic. So the topic today was very much about creative. But of course, you can't really talk about creative without talking about media. And so perhaps can one or both of you offer any perspective on what's been happening over the past 10 weeks in the world of media?
Yeah, I mean, I come from the creative side of our network, but of course I work closely with our media group, and so I'm by no means a media expert. But what's been interesting is, while maybe the past 10 weeks have felt like 10 years to many of us, we have seen a really distinct cycle happen within media. We saw traditional TV viewing largely driven by news and news programming spike during the course of April. But it's now leveled off to pre-crisis levels. So we are seeing, and all the while streaming has continued to increase in terms of usage and engagement. So I think in terms of that streaming versus traditional media, you're going to have an acceleration of the planning and ideation around how to best bring my brand into these new channels that I haven't had before. You're also going to see, for instance, we're working at home more. And so while it doesn't show up in the numbers in spades yet, you can bet, music streaming services and the commercialization of those services is only going to become more important as we work from home and the ability to listen to that over the course of the day. So what we think of as traditional radio is going to continue to change over the course of the next year or so. So media is shifting and changing incredibly quickly, and we've already seen this little cycle happen within the last 10 weeks that's been pretty interesting to be part of.
Ted, this is a TED Talk, so do you want to have the last word on that?
Sure. I mean, I think, we are seeing, as Brett mentioned, a constantly evolving situation. I think it's then important that brands assess what their options are and where their target consumer is at and what they're consuming, and develop campaigns or communications that are tailored towards those media channels. And, potentially the multimedia campaign or the multi-channel campaign looks much different now than it did even 10 weeks ago. But I think it will be important for brands to understand that and to create content that, is appropriate for each of those media channels.
Okay, on that note, thank you to Ted. Thank you, Brett, for joining us. As I said earlier, this session is being recorded and will be available within 48 hours. If you have an interest in knowing more about the study that Ted and his team did, do reach out to him. If you have an interest in learning a little more about the COVID tracking that we've been doing, feel free to contact me, Steve Levy at Ipsos.com. Our next webinar will be on June 2nd at 3:30. Ted, if you could flip that, thank you. When Ray Kong will be covering...
I think I'm frozen a bit, sorry.
That's good, it's good. Ray Kong will be covering financial services post-COVID. Do watch for invitations to the sessions that follow in this program in the coming weeks. Thank you all for joining us, and stay safe.
Thank you.